The year was 1765, in the suffocating confines of a London counting house, where the air tasted perpetually of dust, old parchment, and banked coal fires. Elias Thorne understood the meaning of debt not as a simple mathematical equation, but as a physical wet-a-leaden cloak draped over every waking hour at 28. Elias was physically built for the open air tall, with the broad shoulders of a laborer, and eyes, a startling shade of coastal gray, that perpetually seemed to seek a distant horizon. Yet, he was trapped. He was the sole remaining heir to a minor, but historically respected, mercantile family whose fortunes had been systematically dismantled by 3 generations of bad vestments and 2 particularly disastrous voyages to the Indies. His current occupation, a meticulously dull apprenticeship under the Flintide solicitor, Mr. Jeremiah Finch, was less about learning law and more about the futile task of liquidating the remnants of the Thorne estate. Elias was surrounded by the relics of his family's former splendor. The mahogany desk where his grandfather had signed ruinous contracts, the tarnished silver inkwell, and the leather-bound ledgers whose elegant script chronicled their slow financial demise. The stage was set, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding whisper of inevitability. Elias lived in a small, rented room above a noisy tavern in Cheapside, a far cry from the manor in Surrey that had been sold off a decade prior. He was not destitute, but he was permanently behind the curve, a man whose present was mortgaged by his past. His immediate, pressing conflict was a note of debt, a financial obligation, a few £1,000s, secured by the last tangible asset the family possessed, a small, strangely significant piece of land in the burgeoning British colonies of North America. This particular debt was not merely a monetary figure. It was a debt of honor held by a man named Silas Kett, a shadowy, powerful moneylender whose reputation was carved in ruthless efficiency and cold blood. Kett was not interested in principal or interest. He wanted the collateral. One crisp autumn morning, Mr. Finch summoned Elias to his private office, a place of sepulchral silence only broken by the scratch of his quill. Finch, a man who resembled a trussed turkey with spectacles, pushed a heavy banded document across the desk. "Thorne," Finch began, his voice dry as aged vellum, "Kett is calling in the debt. He gives us precisely 30 days. He is not accepting an extension this time." Elias picked up the document. The language was boilerplate legal menace, but the implications were deeply personal. "The land, sir? It's only a few hundred acres. Why this fixation?" Finch adjusted his spectacles, sighing a puff of stale air. "It is not the land itself, Thorne, but its location. It sits adjacent to several recent, highly profitable timber claims in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Kett is building an empire. Your parcel is the last missing piece in his portfolio. If he forecloses your family name, what little is left of it will be utterly erased. You will be penniless." Elias leaned back, the leaden cloak feeling suddenly heavier. He had always known about the colonial land, vague, unromantic holding, inherited from a forgotten great uncle who had tried and failed to make a fortune in the New World decades ago. It was a ghost asset. "What do you propose, sir?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the sudden spike of fear. Finch tapped the desk with a bony finger. "There is only one solution, however distasteful. You must go there. You must lay a legitimate physical claim, and you must find a way to monetize it to pay Kett off before his deadline. You must sell what the land holds, or sell the land itself for a price Kett cannot match." The thought of leaving London, leaving the only world he knew, felt like a leap into the void. The colonies to Londoners were rough, uncivilized, and dangerous a place for fanatics, failed men, or those seeking illicit wealth. "It is a fool's errand, Mr. Finch," Elias said, running a hand through his dark, close-cropped hair. "I am a clerk, not a frontiersman. Then learn to be one, Finch snapped, uncharacteristically passionate. Because the alternative is beggary. Now, your grandfather left one final item, which I have held in trust for this precise moment. A small piece of leverage, perhaps. Finch opened a locked strongbox and pulled out a single object, a finely wrought, antique compass. It was unlike any Elias had ever seen. The casing was heavy copper, weathered green with age, and the glass face was cloudy. But the needle within was the most curious detail. It did not point north. Instead, its brass tip quivered slightly, perpetually pointing towards a specific, fixed directions southwest by west. This, Finch explained, holding the compass delicately, was found clutched in the hand of your great-uncle when his body was discovered, drowned in a shallow river near his claim. He was not a man of tools, Thorne. He was a scholar. We believe this is not a navigation device, but a marker. Something that points to a specific spot on that land. Elias took the compass. It felt solid, strangely warm, and impossibly old. The copper compass. The compass was not just an artifact. It was a silent promise of either ruin or redemption. His great-uncle, the scholar, had died trying to find something on that land. Had it been a hidden mine? A forgotten cache of goods? Or simply the location of his grave? The forgotten debt was no longer merely a stack of papers and a deadline. It was a destination marked by an enigmatic copper artifact. The shadow of the old world, its failed dreams, its debts, its ruthless creditors was now forcing Elias to step into the dangerous light of the new, the seed of the conflict that evening. Elias sat alone, tracing the worn lines on the compass casing. His initial conflict was the inheritance of failure, but a secondary, more potent conflict was brewing, the conflict of identity. He was a man of books and ledgers, expected to transition into a man capable of surviving a harsh wilderness, outwitting a ruthless creditor like Ket, and perhaps even facing the danger that had claimed his great-uncle. He knew Ket would not stop at London. Ket had eyes and ears everywhere, and he had a ruthless agent already in the colonies, a man named Garrick. Elias's journey to America would not be a quiet retreat to survey land. It would be a race against a well-funded, lethal rival who needed that piece of ground to complete his own. Far grander plan. Elias had 30 days to secure passage, gather the necessary supplies, and somehow transform himself from a solicitor's apprentice into a man capable of laying claim to a dangerous frontier. He stared at the flickering candle flame reflected in the copper casing, and in that moment, the old world shadow finally lifted, replaced by the daunting yet exhilarating clarity of a desperate mission. The only way to escape the crippling debt was to run toward the unknown source of that debt, guided by a compass that promised either fortune or folly. The ship, the Starlight, was departing in 3 weeks. He had to prepare. He had to survive. He had to find what his ancestor had died for. The 3 weeks granted to Elias Thorne before the scheduled departure of the Starlight had been a frantic blur of preparation, fueled by little sleep and gnawing anxiety. He had exchanged his tailored but threadbare London coat for sturdy woolen breeches and a heavy, practical canvas jacket. He sold the last pieces of family silvers save a sentimental locket to secure his passage and purchase a modest array of provisions: salt pork, hard biscuits, a practical hunting knife, and a second-hand serviceable fowling piece. He had succeeded in shedding the external trappings of the old world, but the ghost of his debt and the weight of his mission remained. His mind constantly returned to the silent, enigmatic presence in his satchel, the copper compass, its needle fixed upon an unknown destination in the New World. On his final Tuesday in London, 2 days before he was due to embark, Elias received an unexpected summons. Not from Mr. Finch, but from a hastily scrawled note delivered by a nervous street urchin. It instructed him to meet a W at the darkest corner of a dilapidated coffee house in Wapping, near the docks, precisely at the 11th hour. The note was unsigned, but contained a single chilling phrase: "Kett is watching." Elias's pulse quickened. Silas Kett was an octopus with tentacles reaching into every corner of London's financial and criminal underbelly. A warning from within that network was a danger in itself. He arrived at the coffee house, the Mermaid's Grog, shortly before 11. The establishment reeked of stale ale and cheap tobacco. He found the appointed corner, a shadowed, damp booth near the rear fire exit, favored by those who preferred anonymity. Sitting there, hunched and cloaked, was a man Elias recognized instantly, though he had never formally met him. It was Mr. Alistair Whittle, a junior clerk who had spent years handling the minutiae of Silas Kett's more questionable property acquisitions. Whittle was known for his timidity and his meticulous nature. He was the last person Elias expected to find risking exposure in Wapping. Whittle looked terrified. His face was pale, his eyes darting towards the door every few seconds. He gripped a small, oilskin-wrapped cylinder in his trembling hands. "Thorn," Whittle whispered, his voice thin and strained, barely audible over the drunken chatter. "I cannot stay long. You must listen, and you must forget you ever saw me." Elias slid into the booth opposite him. "Mr. Whittle, why the secrecy? What do you know?" "Everything," Whittle breathed, leaning in until Elias could smell the fear and sweat on him. "I know why Kett wants your pathetic piece of marsh and pine so badly. It is not for the timber, Thorn. The timber is merely the cover story." Whittle glanced wildly around, then slammed the oilskin cylinder onto the table between them. "Kett is not just a moneylender. He is a miner. Or rather, he funds the mining of others. He is absolutely certain, based on old records he acquired, that your great-uncle's claim sits directly atop a massive copper and iron deposit. The richest virgin lode on the entire Atlantic seaboard, they say." Elias felt a cold shock run through him. Copper and iron. The raw materials for a nascent industrial revolution. The wealth that could buy freedom 1,000 times over. But also the wealth that drew sharks. "How can you be sure?" Elias demanded softly. "Because I transcribed the original report for Kett's eyes only," Whittle hissed. "It was written by a French surveyor 20 years ago who tried to buy the land cheaply but failed. The surveyor noted 3 crucial features: a specific geological signature, a mineral spring, and a unique rock formation he called the Serpent's Head. The lode is enormous, Thorn, and Kett knows that the moment you step foot on that soil, the price skyrockets. He wants to foreclose before you can claim or discover anything. And Garrick?" Elias asked, remembering the name Finch had supplied Kett's colonial agent. "Garrick is already there. He is not surveying. He is waiting. He has orders to challenge your claim legally, obstruct your work physically, and if necessary, make sure you don't return to Boston alive." Whittle's voice dropped to a barely audible rasp. "Garrick is a ruthless killer. Kett promised him a percentage of the mine for securing the land. Elias's fate was sealed. He was not just chasing a debt. He was now guarding a treasure of immense value, pursued by a professional killer. The stakes had just risen from financial ruin to mortal danger. "Why are you telling me this, Whittle?" Elias asked, staring into the clerk's desperate eyes. "This risks your life." Whittle lowered his voice further, tears welling up. "My son, my poor boy, Thomas. He died last year from the fever, right after Kett had me forge documents to ruin an honest competitor. I have handled Kett's dirt for 10 years. Thorn, I have earned enough to live comfortably, but I haven't been able to sleep comfortably for a year. This is my penance. My final accounting." Whittle quickly unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was not a formal map, but a brittle, half-destroyed charcoal sketch on thick paper rough. hand-drawn cartography. This is the French surveyor's sketch, Whittle whispered, pushing it towards Elias, the real one. Ket only has a copy. Look closely. The sketch was a topographical maze depicting hills, creeks, and forest boundaries, but marked near the center, where Elias's great-uncle's claim would be, were three faint, hand-drawn symbols: a crude crescent moon, a crossed hammer and chisel, and a jagged line leading away from a small, circled X. The X is the serpent's head formation, Whittle explained urgently. The French report stated that the primary seam runs due west from a point exactly 300 paces north of that rock. That is where the mine must begin. Elias's eyes flickered to his own satchel, where the copper compass lay. The compass pointed southwest by west. The sketch pointed 300 paces north of a known landmark. They were two fragments of the same puzzle. The compass, perhaps, pointed to the location of the serpent's head itself, or a cache left by his great-uncle. "You must take this," Whittle insisted, shoving the sketch into Elias's hand. "Memorize it, burn it immediately. If Ket ever suspects—" Whittle abruptly stood up, knocking his chair slightly. "I'm compromised now. If you succeed, Thorne, remember that Thomas Whittle died because of Ket's greed. Just live honestly if you can." Before Elias could thank him, Whittle melted into the shadows and slipped out the back door. Elias was left alone in the reeking coffee house, holding a scrap of charcoal-stained paper that was worth a king's ransom and a death sentence. He had arrived in Wapping with a single, difficult choice: go to America and fight Ket's foreclosure, or surrender and become a London pauper now. The choice was infinitely harder and more complex: to pursue the wealth on the map, knowing it would make him a target, or to abandon the map and the hidden load, settle his debt with a minor sale, and likely face Ket's long-term retribution anyway. The French map was a beacon. It promised not just solvency, but immense, life-altering wealth. It represented the power to resurrect the Thorne name and live free of the old world's debt forever. However, chasing that fortune meant directly challenging Silas Ket and facing Garrick in a lawless, unfamiliar territory. It meant embracing the life of a desperate adventurer, a prospector, and maybe a fugitive. Elias quickly committed the rough sketch to memory, paying close attention to the symbols. He then ordered a tankard of ale, excused himself to the outside privy, and there, shielded by the damp brick wall, he tore the precious cartography into small, irregular strips and fed them into the flickering remains of the coffeehouse fire. The charcoal lines turned to ash, the secret absorbed only by his memory. Returning to his lodgings, Elias sat on his cot, the copper compass in one hand, the memory of the French sketch blazing in his mind. The two objects, the compass and the cartography, were mutually reinforcing. A confirmation that his journey was not just desperate, but profoundly significant. He had 30 days until Ket's deadline. The voyage itself would take 8 to 10 weeks. This meant he had to find, survey, and monetize the copper lode before Ket could legally take possession. Or he had to leverage the threat of the discovery to negotiate a payoff. He chose the harder path, the one Whittle's confession had laid out for him. He would not just fight the debt. He would seize the fortune. He would become the keeper of the secret cartography. He would rely on the copper compass to guide him to the starting point. The old world's shadow had been cast by debt and shame. The new world's challenge would be cast by immense wealth and deadly rivalry. Elias Thorne, the timid clerk, died in the confines of that London room. In his place stood a man with a hidden map in his mind, a heavy compass in his pack, and a new, terrifying resolve. He locked his door, packed his fowling piece, and waited for the dawn that would lead him to the decks of the Starlight and the perilous voyage ahead. The docks of London were a chaotic symphony of shouts, creaking ropes, and the pervasive stench of fish and tar. Elias Thorne stood on the gangplank of the brigantine Starlight, clutching his modest satchel as if it contained his very soul. The Starlight was a sturdy three-masted vessel, built more for cargo efficiency than passenger comfort. She was heading for the bustling port of Boston, carrying everything from West Indian rum to iron tools and, crucially for Elias, the hope of a fresh start as he boarded. The atmosphere immediately shifted from the ordered decay of London to the raw, untamed reality of the sea. The deck was slick with morning dew and previous voyages' grime. The captain, a broad, weather-beaten Scot named Captain Monroe, had eyes the color of the northern sea and a voice that could cut through a gale. "You'll be Thorne." The quiet one, Monroe observed gruffly, squinting at Elias. "Cabin B, keep your head down. Keep out of the way, and don't trouble my crew. We've got cargo to move, not gentlemen to pamper." Elias was assigned a cramped, airless cabin below the waterline, shared with 3 other men. One was a dour, silent cooper returning to Philadelphia. Another, an overly enthusiastic young missionary named Thomas, bound for the frontier settlements. And the third, a muscular, watchful man named Jedediah Shaw, a professed Boston ship chandler. From the moment the Starlight slipped its mooring lines and the final shouts of the dock workers faded, Elias felt the visceral separation from the old world. He watched the white cliffs of Dover recede, feeling a strange mix of terror and relief. The land of his birth, of his crushing debt, was shrinking into a hazy shadow. The first few weeks of the voyage were a brutal education. The Atlantic was less a gentle passage and more a relentless, churning adversary. Elias suffered the miserable reality of the seasickness that plagued all landlubbers, confined to his bunk. Too weak to care about the urgent secret of the copper compass or the threat of Silas Kett, he learned the grinding, monotonous routine of life aboard a sailing vessel, the constant creak of the hull, the smell of bilge and unwashed bodies, the meager rations of hardtack and watered grog. He learned to sleep through the storms when the ship bucked and pitched like a mad horse, and the roar of the wind sounded like a legion of angry spirits. As his stomach settled, Elias began to use the tedious time for preparation. He used the quiet hours on deck, staring out at the limitless gray ocean, to rehearse the crucial elements of the French surveyor's sketch he had memorized. He mentally mapped the serpent's head, traced the route of the mineral spring, and counted the 300 paces north where the lode was supposed to begin. He also spent time with his prized possession, the copper compass. Alone in his bunk, he would study its needle. The brass tip consistently quivered, pointing southwest by west. He knew from his few conversations with Captain Monroe that this direction was roughly aligned with the area of the Massachusetts Bay Colony where his land lay. The compass was his secondary silent guide, a confirmation of the map in his mind. The crew of the Starlight was typical, rough, superstitious, and skilled. But it was among his fellow passengers that Elias felt a subtle, unnerving tension. The young missionary Thomas was harmless, prone to preaching about salvation. But the cooper was withdrawn, and Jedediah Shaw, the ship chandler, was a persistent, watchful presence. Shaw was a man of medium height, with a deceptive slowness in his movements and eyes that missed nothing. He often sat on a coil of rope, carving a piece of driftwood, and always seemed to be within earshot when Elias was on deck. One breezy afternoon, Elias was polishing his fowling piece, a necessary chore. Shaw drifted over. "Fine piece of weaponry, Mr. Thorne," Shaw said, his voice flat, his Boston accent noticeable. "Planning to hunt deer, are we?" "Or perhaps a bear," Elias replied, keeping his tone light. "The colonial woods are full of them, I hear." "Indeed, and full of worse things, too. Some men, they mistake a chance at wealth for a friendly welcome. The frontier has sharp teeth for the unprepared." Shaw's knife paused in its carving. You're a London man. What brings a solicitor's apprentice out to the Bay Colony? Elias had prepared for this. Inheritance. A small, forgotten parcel of land. Nothing more than marsh and pine, I suspect. Just enough to settle a few lingering debts back home. Shaw smiled, a thin, humorless movement of his lips. Debt is a persistent ghost, Mr. Thorne. It follows a man across the ocean. Hope your patch of marsh is worth the journey. The exchange left Elias cold. Shaw's questions were too precise, his interest too keen. Elias began to suspect that Jedediah Shaw was no mere ship chandler. He was the eyes and ears of Silas Kett, or perhaps even Garrick himself. Kett's colonial agent. Kett had acted fast, planting an operative on the very ship Elias had booked. This suspicion forced Elias into a difficult strategic choice. Should he avoid Shaw and risk seeming secretive? Or should he play the part of the naive, debt-ridden fool and throw Shaw off the scent? He chose the latter. He began to exaggerate his seasickness, complain loudly about the uselessness of the land he was inheriting, and made sure Shaw witnessed him poring over dull, legitimate-looking London deeds that had nothing to do with copper. He cultivated an air of genteel incompetence. The journey was punctuated by two major perils, testing the resilience of the Starlight and the nerves of her passengers. The first was a storm of legendary ferocity off the coast of Newfoundland. It lasted 2 full days. The waves were mountains of black water. The wind screamed and the Starlight groaned under the assault. Elias, now hardened, stood on deck during a terrifying watch, lashed to the mast, helping the crew secure loose lines. During the height of the storm, a rogue wave struck, tearing a piece of railing and nearly sweeping the cooper overboard. Elias, acting instinctively, grabbed the man's coat and hauled him back to safety. Jedediah Shaw witnessed the action from the relative shelter of the companionway. The exchange of looks between them was brief but potent. Shaw's eyes held grudging respect, but the suspicion did not lessen. Elias was learning that survival on the frontier would demand not just cleverness, but physical capability. The second peril was human. Off the coast of the Grand Banks, a suspicious sloop, flying no colors, shadowed the Starlight for a day and a night. Captain Monroe feared pirates. The crew loaded the cannons, and for hours the air was thick with tension, every eye strained against the horizon. Elias felt the cold grip of fear, not for his life, but for the failure of his mission. To be captured or sunk now, with the map in his mind and the compass in his hand, would be the ultimate defeat. He slipped down to his cabin, took out the copper compass, and held it. Its smooth, cold surface was a connection to the solid ground he yearned for. He realized he needed to protect the artifact. He carefully cut a small slit into the lining of his canvas jacket, nestled the heavy copper disc inside, and sewed it shut with rough thread. The compass would be his constant companion, a hidden talisman as dawn broke. The sloop veered off, disappearing into the mist. Captain Monroe breathed a sigh of relief. Though he remained watchful as the weeks bled into one another, Elias's transformation continued. He lost the pale, soft look of the London clerk. His hands grew rougher, and the perpetual rocking of the ship became his new normal. He learned nautical terms, the necessity of silence, and the value of a single, dry biscuit. He had survived the sea. Now he had to survive the land. On the morning of the 59th day, Captain Monroe's voice roared down the hatchway. Land ahoy! The shores of Massachusetts. Elias rushed onto the deck. Before him, emerging from the early morning haze, was the American coastline, a vast, dark green expanse of endless forest meeting the gray-blue sea. It was immense, imposing, and utterly wild. It looked nothing like the manicured estates of Surrey or the brick canyons of London. It was the land of the Serpent's Head, the Copper Lode, and the deadly Garrick. Jedediah Shaw stood nearby, watching the coast with an expression Elias could not decipher. As the starlight began its slow approach to Boston Harbor, Shaw walked deliberately to Elias. "A long journey, Mr. Thorne," Shaw said, his eyes fixed on the mainland. "Enjoy your inheritance. But be careful. Sometimes the debt you owe to the old world is less dangerous than the fortune you find in the new." He offered his hand. Elias shook it, noting the surprising strength in Shaw's grip. The handshake felt less like a farewell and more like a declaration of war. The ship dropped anchor in the bustling, thriving chaos of Boston Harbor. The air was colder, cleaner, and filled with the ringing sounds of industry and the shouts of an aggressive, growing populace. The starlight had brought him across the perilous waters. Elias Thorne had arrived, his pockets light, his jacket hiding a copper secret, and the whispered cartography burned into his mind. The final phase of the race against Ket had begun. Boston in the late autumn of 1765 was a jarring spectacle of raw energy and burgeoning civilization, a stark contrast to the ancient regulated order of London. The harbor bustled with masts and warehouses. The streets were a muddy, cacophonous mix of merchants, sailors, and restless citizens already murmuring against the restrictive British taxes. Elias Thorne spent 3 days in Boston, a necessary interval for provisioning and gathering intelligence. He sold his last few negotiable items, a heavy silver watch and a crested family ring, to purchase a hardy mare named Bess, a sturdy saddle, more powder and shot, and enough dried pemmican to last the journey inland. During this time, he carefully avoided Jedediah Shaw, who, Elias learned from a tavern barkeep, was indeed known less as a ship chandler and more as a fixer for powerful interests. Man with deep ties to the land claims north of the city. The suspicion that Shaw was Ket's agent solidified into chilling certainty. Elias knew Shaw would be following. The race was on. Ilias's land claim lay nearly 100 miles to the northwest, a rugged tract of territory near the New Hampshire border, known colloquially by the settlers as the North Woods. He headed west, leaving the coastal settlements and the relative civilization of the King's Highway behind. The landscape immediately began its relentless transformation. The tidy fenced fields of the settled areas quickly gave way to the true American wilderness. The roads narrowed to rough, deeply rutted paths, then mere trails only distinguishable by Bess's instinct. The air grew colder, sharper, smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and wood smoke from isolated trappers' cabins. Elias was accustomed to the controlled forests of England, easy, managed, and navigable. The colonial woods were terrifyingly different, dense, seemingly endless, and silent in a way that felt both majestic and utterly menacing. The massive white pines, maples, and oaks towered overhead, their branches forming a perpetually shadowed canopy that swallowed the light. His first impression was overwhelming, a profound sense of insignificance. He, a man whose world was ruled by the delicate balance of pounds, shillings, and pence, was now pitted against a force of nature that cared nothing for human contracts or debts. The journey became a daily, grinding battle against the elements and his own inexperience. He struggled to maintain a consistent pace, slowed by swampy patches and dense undergrowth. He had to learn quickly how to set a rudimentary snare for a small game, how to identify edible berries from poisonous ones, and the crucial skill of setting a fire that wouldn't betray his presence but would keep the fierce chill at bay. He relied entirely on his pocket compass for general direction, and, in the evening, by the faint light of his small lantern, he would take out the copper compass. Its unwavering, silent pole southwest by west gave him a crucial, if mysterious, fixed point in a world of variables. One evening, after several days of hard travel, Elias made a critical mistake. He missed the subtle markers left by a previous traveler, and strayed into an area of dense, confusing terrain. The sun dipped below the horizon with alarming speed, plunging the forest into deep, impenetrable darkness. He was forced to make camp in a tangle of thicket. Acutely aware of the snapping twigs and rustling leaves around him, sounds that, in London, would be mere nuisance, but here sounded like the stalkings of large, unseen predators. He woke before dawn to the sound of an immense, crashing racket. A large black bear had approached his camp, drawn by the smell of his food cache, which was only poorly secured. Terror spiked through him, freezing him for a precious second. The bear was massive, its eyes gleaming in the pre-dawn gloom. Remembering his training, Elias fumbled for his fowling piece. He knew the lead shot was more likely to enrage the beast than kill it, but he had no choice. He raised the gun, his hands shaking violently, and fired. The sound was deafening. The bear, startled and grazed, let out a tremendous roar and retreated into the bush, not out of fear, but startled confusion. Elias sat trembling for an hour, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the cold air. The encounter was a brutal lesson. The wilderness was unforgiving, and survival depended on constant vigilance, preparedness, and a willingness to use force. The old world's rules of polite negotiation and contracts meant nothing here. After nearly 3 weeks of solitary, arduous travel, Elias reached the approximate region of his claim. He recognized the terrain described in his great uncle's meager notes, a specific confluence of 2 creeks, and beyond them, a geological formation unlike any he had seen. He finally reached the eastern edge of his land, a breathtaking, intimidating landmark known locally as the Palisades. The Palisades were a series of sheer, high rock cliffs, a natural fortress carved by ancient glacial activity. They rose dramatically from the surrounding valley floor, their dark, moss-covered faces running for miles, forming a natural barrier against the untamed lands to the west. The forest immediately surrounding the base was especially dense, almost a tangle of primordial growth. Elias secured Bess in a thicket, his heart pounding not from exhaustion, but from the immense gravity of the moment. He was finally here. This rugged, beautiful, menacing ground was the source of his family's debt, the subject of Ket's avarice, and the resting place of the forgotten copper lode. He pulled the copper compass from his jacket lining. Stepping onto the land, the needle seemed to settle, its gentle quiver gone, pointing with absolute certainty toward the southwest face of the Palisades, the vast, shadowed rock wall that marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. Elias began to survey the land, guided by the compass and the sketch burned into his memory. He spent an anxious day trekking along the base of the cliffs, looking for the crucial landmark, the Serpent's Head, the unique rock formation the French surveyor had marked with an X. It was late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low and casting long skeletal shadows, when he found it, tucked into a fold in the rock face. Near where a small, clear spring emerged was an outcrop of stone that, with a little imagination, did resemble a colossal quowl. Flattened serpent's head, its mouth open to the sky. Elias knelt beside it. This was the heart of the puzzle. This was the X on the map according to the cartography. The rich copper seam began 300 paces north of this point. Elias stood up, his gaze sweeping across the daunting face of the Palisades and the thick forest beyond. He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to rush. He knew this was the most dangerous moment. If Ket's agent, Garrick, was anywhere nearby, this point would be his focus. He had to make a final, decisive choice. Should he immediately start searching for the lode 300 paces north, risking discovery by Garrick, or should he spend time securing his position, establishing his legal claim, and attempting to hide the purpose of his presence? The deadline for Ket's foreclosure was rapidly approaching. He had to find evidence of the lotus sample, a seam, anything to negotiate or pay off the debt. Time was his enemy. He chose to proceed immediately, but with extreme caution. He spent an hour preparing a small, concealed camp away from the spring, creating a cold camp without fire, as the absolute darkness of the wilderness settled. Elias took his first 300 paces north of the serpent's head, counting each step meticulously in the gloom. When he reached the 300th pace, he stopped. He was in a thicket of scrub and rock, a place of intense silence. He knelt, and using the trowel he had brought, he began to dig. He dug for hours, the earth yielding slowly to muscle and effort. His hands blistered, his muscles screamed, but he continued, driven by the desperation of debt and the tantalizing promise of fortune. At length, his trowel struck something harder than rock. It was a faint metallic sheen buried just beneath the surface of dark, greenish-blue rock mixed with soil. He scraped away the dirt and held the piece of ore up to the faint starlight. It was heavy, crystalline, and unlike any stone he had ever encountered. The unmistakable faint shimmer of copper sulfide was visible. He had found the seam. A wave of dizzying triumph washed over him, immediately followed by the cold realization of the danger. He had the prize. Now he had to defend it. Elias carefully covered his small excavation, concealing the traces of his search. He retreated to his cold camp, the piece of ore pressed against his chest beneath his jacket. Beside the hidden copper compass, he had survived the ocean and found the goal hidden within the unforgiving wilderness. But as he listened to the deep, resonant silence of the American night, broken only by the hoot of a distant owl, Elias knew he was not alone. The wilderness had eyes, and the debt he was running from had found him. The conflict with nature was over. The conflict with man, embodied by the unseen Garrick, was about to begin. The discovery of the copper lode that vein of greenish blue or hidden beneath. The forest floor was both Elias Thorne's salvation and his most immediate peril. He spent the next few days not mining, but surviving, carefully monitoring the area around the serpent's head. He confirmed the lode's potential and secured samples. But the immense, lonely silence of the woods pressed in on him. He was a trespasser on ancient land, guarding a secret that could easily cost him his life. The danger was not only Garrick, Ket's ruthless agent, but the land itself and its original inhabitants. Elias knew that his claim, legally granted by a distant king in London, meant little to the people who had lived here for centuries. Asterisk. Elias's anxiety was realized 3 days after his discovery. He was checking his meager snares near the northern creek when he sensed, rather than heard, a presence. He froze, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his knife. Emerging from the dense undergrowth, moving with a fluid silence that mocked his own clumsy progress, were 3 figures. They were Algonquin tall, lean, and dressed in deer hides, their faces painted with ochre. They carried bows and arrows, their expressions impassive and deeply assessing. The eldest of the 3, a powerful man whose hair was streaked with gray and who wore a necklace of polished bear claws, stepped forward. This was the Sachem Kitchkanet, the revered leader of the local branch of the Nipmuc tribe. Elias had read enough pamphlets in London to know that his first move must be one of absolute deference and non-aggression. He immediately unslung his fowling piece and slowly laid it on the ground, then raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Kitchkanet halted a few paces away. He spoke, his voice low and resonant, in a language Elias did not understand. But the meaning was clear. Who are you, and why are you defiling our land? Elias searched his limited knowledge of colonial interaction. He pointed to himself. Elias Thorne, traveler, not settler. He then pointed to the surrounding forest. Yours, I seek passage and trade. He used the one universal language he knew, pulling a small pouch of tobacco, a high-value trading commodity, from his jacket and placing it carefully on a flat stone. Kitchkanet's eyes narrowed, not at the gift, but at the jacket. The chief noticed the subtle bulge where the copper compass was sewn into the lining. Kitchener spoke a short, sharp phrase to one of his companions, a young man who looked at Elias with unconcealed suspicion. Kitchener then pointed to the serpent's head formation and made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the area where Elias had dug. The message was unambiguous. "We know what you are looking for." Elias realized he could not lie. He took a deep breath, walked to his pack, and carefully extracted the two small, heavy pieces of copper ore he had dug up. He walked back to the stone and placed the glittering metallic rocks beside the tobacco. "Metal," Elias said, tapping the ore. "Stone, I need this. I offer trade, tools, cloth, iron." Kitchener stared at the ore for a long, silent moment. The Nipmuc knew of the metals in the earth. Their shamans had long warned of the dangers of digging up the blood of the mountain. But Kitchener was a sachem trying to guide his people through a changing world increasingly encroached upon by aggressive English and French settlers. His people needed iron axes, durable kettles, and gunpowder to compete with neighboring tribes who had already embraced European trade. Kitchener spoke again, this time pointing to the south. "Black robes. Other English. They burn the forest. They take all. You are different." The chief's question was a profound challenge. Are you like the others? Elias knew this was the moment of decision. He had to forge an alliance based on mutual need, or he would be hunted off the land. His mission, a failure. "I am not like the others," Elias stated firmly, looking directly into the sachem's eyes. "They seek to own the land. I seek only the metal in the stone. I will take only what I can carry. I will not burn the forest. I will respect the spirits of the spring, and I will pay you, not with trinkets, but with knowledge and iron." Elias walked back to his horse, Bess, and returned with his newest, sharpest hatchet, an English-made tool with a heavy, perfect head. He presented it to Kitchener. "For protection," Elias said, "from the black robes and from the others who come to steal." Kitchener took the hatchet. He tested its weight, his thumb tracing the sharp edge. The sheer, clean efficiency of the iron tool was clearly appealing. The sachem finally spoke in broken English, having tested Elias's patience and honesty. "You seek the red metal. It is guarded by spirits. Many men before you sought it. They died. You pay us in iron. You pay us in fire powder. And you leave no trace of your digging. No other English sees your work. This is the oath." Elias understood. The Nipmuc were offering a precarious conditional truce. They would tolerate his presence, perhaps even shield him from other, more aggressive white settlers, in exchange for a continuous supply of vital European goods. More importantly, they were demanding absolute secrecy regarding the discovery of the lode. If the full rush of English prospectors arrived, led by Ket's men, the Nipmuc's way of life would be destroyed. "I agree," Elias said, pressing his hand to his chest, directly over the hidden copper compass. "No other English will know of this stone. We work in the shadow. I bring the iron. You protect the secret." Kitchener nodded slowly. "The oath is made, but we watch. You betray the oath, the forest will claim you." He then gestured to the young man who had been suspicious of Elias. "This is Wamsuta. He is your shadow. He speaks little English. He sees all." Wamsuta stepped forward, his face still unreadable, but his eyes conveyed a fierce, protective hostility. He was the enforcer, the keeper of the oath. Elias had acquired his guide and his protector, but at a price he was now entirely beholden to the discretion and goodwill of the Nipmuc. The alliance was a shield, but also a cage. The following day, Elias and Wamsuta began their work. The cultural clash was immediate and profound. Wamsuta was appalled by Elias's haste and his utilitarian approach to the land. When Elias tried to clear a small patch of brush for better access to the digging site, Wamsuta stopped him, pointing to a small, unassuming patch of wild mint, spirit herb. You do not cut. When Elias was careless with his water supply, Wamsuta showed him how to purify it with charcoal and moss. He taught Elias how to move through the forest without snapping twigs, how to track game efficiently, and how to read the clouds for signs of impending weather. Elias, in turn, taught Wamsuta about the English clockwork he carried, the mechanics of his fowling piece, and, most crucially, the principles of leverage and geometry that would be necessary to extract the heavy ore. The mutual need was stark. Elias needed the Nipmuc's knowledge of the land and their protection from Garrick. Kitchenet needed Elias's goods specifically, the iron and powder that would ensure his tribe's survival against encroaching rivals and the brutal colonial winter. Elias often felt the weight of Kitchenet's wisdom. The sachem did not see the ore as potential wealth, but as a dangerous force. The metal burns the heart. Englishman Kitchenet warned him one evening, watching Elias chip away at the earth. It makes men forget the sun and the soil. Your debt is not to Ket. Your debt is to the mountain. Elias found himself confronting a moral dilemma far more profound than the one posed by his London ledger. Was he just a different kind of settler, ultimately destined to ruin this land and its people through his ambition? Or could he honor his oath, take only what he needed to secure his freedom, and leave the wilderness intact? He was mining the lode, but he was also mining a deeper truth about himself and the nature of the new world, the copper compass, which had guided him to the serpent's head, was the physical embodiment of the old world's debt and the new world's fortune. Now, with Wamsuta standing guard, the compass pointed not just to wealth, but to a precarious political and cultural responsibility. Elias knew that Ket and Garrick would soon arrive, bringing their aggressive, destructive brand of claim-making. When they came, the fragile oath and the uneasy alliance with the Nipmuc would be the only thing standing between Elias Thorne and utter ruin. He had made his choice. He would honor the promise to Kitchenet, and together they would face the English shadow. The fragile peace established with Sachem Kitchenet and the constant, silent surveillance of Wamsuta provided Elias Thorne with a crucial, yet limited, window of opportunity. He had the ore samples, the copper compass guiding him to the source, and the French cartography etched in his memory. Now, he had to transform the theoretical claim on paper into a tangible, legally defensible boundary on the Groundan Act of ownership that would stand up against Silas Ket's imminent foreclosure. The conflict shifted from raw survival to technical, legal warfare conducted in the wilderness. Elias had wisely spent a portion of his money in Boston on the essential tools of the frontier surveyor, a brass chain of Gunter's measure, a heavy-duty tripod, a compass separate from his copper secret, and a transetta precise instrument designed for mapping terrain and angles. These were the weapons of colonial expansion, the instruments that translated ancient forests into neat, sellable parcels. His legal claim, derived from his great-uncle's original deed, was infuriatingly vague, a tract of 700 acres, beginning at the confluence of the two northern creeks, thence running west by north for 120 chains, and thence south. The boundaries were based on long-gone trees and ambiguous landmarks. Elias needed to re-establish the boundaries with modern precision and, crucially, lodge the new, verified survey with the Colonial Land Office in Boston before Ket's deadline. He began the arduous process of surveying, or running the lines, a deeply symbolic and physically taxing act in the untamed wilderness. He worked in tandem with Wamsuta, whose role became invaluable, not just as a guard, but as a guide through the impenetrable thickets and treacherous ravines. You draw lines on water. Englishman Wamsuta observed one misty morning. watching Elias struggle to drag the chain of measure through a tangle of briars. The lines are not real. The river is real. The mountain is real. Elias understood the cultural clash. For Wamsuta, the land was a living entity, shared and respected. For Elias, it was currency, freedom, and the solution to a generations-old debt. The lines are real to the king's law. Wamsuta, Elias explained, sweating profusely. And the king's law is the only way to stop the black robes, the other English, from taking the whole mountain. The surveying was a marathon of intense labor. Elias had to hack his way through undergrowth, sight the transit over long distances, and hammer in stakes and blaze boundary trees stripping. A thin layer of bark to mark the property line. The physical demands were immense. He suffered from blistered hands, insect bites, and the constant threat of injury in the rugged terrain. He learned the value of Wamsuta's deep woods knowledge, which allowed them to navigate steep ravines and avoid sinkholes. Elias had a tactical objective. Beyond mere boundary marking, he had to ensure that the newly surveyed boundaries legally enveloped the serpent's head formation and the rich copper lode. The ambiguity of the original deed gave him some latitude. He intentionally shifted the westernmost boundary slightly north to include a vital mineral spring, near the lode source of water that would be essential for any future mining operation. During this meticulous work, Elias kept the samples of copper ore hidden and continued to consult the two central tools of his private mission, the copper compass and the memory of the French, cartography. The copper compass, safely sewn into his jacket, guided his movements, confirming he was always moving toward the heart of the richest territory. The urgency of the task intensified when Elias found the first subtle sign of Ket's presence. They were running the northern boundary line, deep in a stand of ancient hemlocks. When Wamsuta suddenly stopped, his hand raised. He pointed to a small, recently broken branch too high for a deer, too clean for a storm. "Not our mark," Wamsuta whispered, his voice taut. "Englishman's mark, not yours." Elias examined the break. It was a precise, sharp snap, likely made by a large boot or a careless hand, not the deliberate blaze mark of a surveyor. Someone had been through here recently. Moving with the arrogance of one who believed the land was already his, they followed the faint trail for 50 yards. They found a small, extinguished campfire, carefully covered with leaves, but not well enough to hide the scorched earth. Beside the ashes was a small, unmistakable object, a spent lead ball, slightly flattened, of a caliber Elias recognized as being larger than his own fowling piece. "Garrick," Elias muttered, his stomach clenching. He realized Ket's agent had arrived and was actively scouting the area, likely searching for the same ambiguous landmarks. Elias was trying to redefine. The realization forced a difficult choice upon Elias. Should he abandon the surveying and immediately focus on fortifying the lode site against Garrick, or press on to complete the vital legal documentation? He knew the lode itself was worthless without a legally recognized claim. If Garrick filed his own survey first, or if Ket foreclosed, all of Elias's physical labor would be nullified. "We continue the line," Elias commanded Wamsuta, strapping on his heavy transit. "But we work faster. And we will set a trap for the one who follows." For the next week, they worked in a state of high alert. Elias surveyed with the speed of desperation, Wamsuta acting as his vigilant shadow, constantly checking their back trail and sweeping the woods for signs of intrusion. Finally, after days of continuous effort, Elias reached the final boundary corner. He drove the final wooden stake, carved with his initials, deep into the earth, and sighted the transit one last time, verifying the closure of the claim. The survey was complete. He had mathematically and physically defined his 700 acres, making sure the serpent's head and the copper lode were securely within the boundaries. The act of drawing that line felt like an immense Defiant gesture against the old world debt, Elias pulled the thick roll of parchment, the official field notes, and the meticulously drawn map from his waterproof oilskin pouch. This document was now more valuable than any bank draft. "It is done," Elias said, exhaling a long breath. "The boundaries are set." Wamsuta looked at the map. It was a chaotic, precise rendering of the line's angles and natural markers of their area geometry imposed upon nature. "The lines are on the paper," Wamsuta repeated. "The man who follows will not respect the paper." Elias knew Wamsuta was right. The act of surveying was over, but the defense of the claim was just beginning. He had the legal document, but he was hundreds of miles from Boston. And Ket's deadline was closing in faster than he could ride. That evening, as they shared a meal of dried deer meat, Elias confided his new strategy to Wamsuta. "The time for secrecy is ending," Elias said. "Ket's man knows I am here. Now, I must risk making my claim public. We need to get this map to Boston." The final, most difficult choice remained. Who could he trust to make the dangerous 100-mile journey back to Boston to file the crucial documents before Ket's men could intercept them? Elias could not abandon the load leaving. It unguarded was an open invitation to Garrick. He looked at Wamsuta, the man whose initial hostility had tempered into a grim, mutual respect. "Wamsuta," Elias said, "I need you to carry a message to Boston. A claim for the land. I will pay you with the largest consignment of iron and powder you have ever seen." Wamsuta stared at the parchment, then back at Elias. "The king's paper," he said, touching the map. "I carry the paper. But the king's men must honor the Nipmuc. The oath must be part of the filing. It must be written, 'The Nipmuc nation holds the covenant over the mountain's blood.'" Elias, realizing the depth of Kitchkinet's commitment and his own dependence on the tribe, nodded without hesitation. "It will be written. Your safety and your people's claim will be my oath." The act of ownership was complete. The surveyor's line had been run. Now the destiny of the land rested on a desperate journey through the treacherous wilderness, carried by an unlikely messenger bound by an oath of iron and secrecy. Elias knew he had just sent Wamsuta into mortal danger. But it was the only way to challenge the shadow of the old world's debt and claim the promise of the new. The moment Wamsuta disappeared into the dense, snow-dusted pines carrying the meticulously drawn survey map toward Boston, Elias Thorne found himself utterly alone on his claim. He was left with Bess, his weary mare, a shrinking supply of provisions, the hidden copper compass, and the immediate, crushing need to prepare for the inevitable. The arrival of Garrick and the onset of the Northwood's infamous winter, the race against Ket's deadline, was now compounded by a battle against nature. Elias knew he had to establish a secure, hidden base. He chose a small, protected clearing near the Serpent's Head, utilizing a natural overhang of rock near the stream close enough to the copper lode for defense, yet visually obscured by the sheer face of the Palisades. His immediate task was twofold: survival and concealment. He spent 10 brutal days constructing a small, sturdy lean-to, reinforcing the walls with thick layers of pine boughs and mud for insulation. He channeled water from the nearby mineral spring using hollowed logs, ensuring a constant, fresh supply without needing to expose himself daily. His supplies were meager. He had to hunt constantly, a skill he was still only marginally competent at. He learned to distinguish the subtle tracks of deer and hare from the more dangerous signs of wolf and bobcat. The wilderness, however, was already tightening its grip. Game was moving south, sensing the shift in the seasons. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in his stomach. The first serious snow fell on a frigid night, a silence so profound it was menacing. Elias woke to a world transformed, soft, deep, and utterly white. The beauty was deceptive. The snow was a prison, sealing the trails and burying the last remnants of forage. The challenge escalated immediately. Moving silently became impossible. Every step was a loud crunch. Hunting became exponentially harder. The cold was the true enemy, a pervasive, bone-aching chill that seeped through his woolen layers, making every movement a conscious, painful effort. He had to burn wood constantly, risking the smoke betraying his position, or face certain freezing. He devoted his meager energy to chipping away at the copper load, not to make a profit, but to gather enough rich or to serve as proof of the mine's existence, proof that could be used in a legal negotiation. If Wamsuta's journey failed, the copper was cold and unyielding, mocking his desperate efforts. The deeper challenge arrived not from an enemy's bullet, but from a microbe. Approximately 3 weeks after Wamsuta left, Elias woke one morning to a dizzying disorientation. His throat was raw, his limbs ached, and his forehead was burning with fever. He had contracted the camp fever, common affliction in the harsh, unsanitary conditions of the frontier. It was a crisis that pushed him beyond the limits of mere physical endurance. The fever raged, punctuated by shivering fits that felt like convulsions. He became delirious, trapped in a hazy world where the faces of Silas Kett and Garrick merged with the menacing shadows of the forest. He hallucinated the voice of his father, chiding him for his failure, and the image of the copper compass floating just out of reach. Its needle spinning wildly, he was entirely alone, unable to hunt, unable to gather wood, and desperately weak. Survival now hinged entirely on his will. The test of will. The choice was simple: surrender to the warmth of the fever. Stop fighting and die quietly in the frozen shelter, or drag himself up, find water, and force food down his throat. He crawled to the stream, breaking the ice with a stone. The shock of the freezing water brought a momentary clarity. He had to survive. He had the compass, the map, and the oath to the Nipmuc. The debt was not yet paid. For 3 days and 3 nights, he fought the fever. He survived on melted snow, a tiny piece of dried venison, and the bitter medicinal tea he managed to brew from pine needles, remembering Wamsuta's lessons. He clung to the physical proof of his mission: the smooth, heavy weight of the copper compass sewn into his jacket, and the small bag of metallic ore samples he kept hidden under his sleeping furs. They were his anchors to reality, just as the worst of the fever began to break. Leaving him weak but alive, the shadow arrived. It was mid-afternoon, silent and clear. Elias was too weak to stand watch, barely able to sit up and tend his tiny fire. He heard it, the unmistakable sound of breaking brush and the crunch of snow. Deliberate and heavy, not the movement of game. 2 men on horseback stood at the edge of his clearing. The first was a large, brutal-looking man in a heavy fur coat, his face scarred, his eyes cold and devoid of conscience. This was Garrick Kett's agent. He carried a heavy flintlock rifle across his saddle. The second man was Jedediah Shaw, the ship chandler from the Starlight. Shaw looked at Elias, a triumphant sneer curling his lips. Well, Garrick drawled, his voice a low menace that seemed too loud in the silent woods. The little English clerk. Took you long enough to find your way. We've been waiting for the first freeze. Elias struggled to rise, grabbing his fowling piece. He was shaking, but not entirely from the cold. He leveled the gun. You are trespassing. This land is claimed. Shaw dismounted, his movements unnervingly smooth. The claim is not filed, Thorne. We checked the Boston office. Your 30 days expire this week. The land is forfeit to Mr. Kett. We're just here to oversee the transition and ensure you sign the proper release papers. Garrick laughed, a harsh, grating sound. And if you don't sign, lad, the wolves will find your frozen carcass, and your papers will never make it back to Boston. Your fever makes it look like a natural death. Elias knew he could not fight both men in his weakened state, especially not Garrick, who looked like a professional hunter of men. His mission was not to die, but to preserve the evidence of the copper lode and the documentation of his claim. He realized his final terrible choice was now upon him. Should he attempt a futile fight to the death, or should he attempt to mislead Garrick and Shaw long enough for Wamsuta's return to matter? Elias leaned heavily against his shelter, trying to project a strength he did not possess. He lowered his weapon slightly. "You have the advantage," Elias conceded, his voice raspy from the fever. "But you are fools if you think this is all there is." He pointed a trembling finger toward the sheer face of the Palisades, far to the northwest of the true copper lode. "The claim is here, yes. But the value is not in the timber. It's in the stone, the ore." He reached into his jacket, pulled out the small pouch of copper samples, and tossed them onto the snow. The greenish-blue metal lay sparkling against the white. "That's just surface scatter," Garrick dismissed, though his eyes showed a flicker of greed. "No," Elias countered, fighting to keep his teeth from chattering. "The main lode runs deep. But not here. It runs along the northwest ridge past the highest peak. My great-uncle left a markera strange, copper compass. It points directly to the main seam, but the lode is unstable there. You need blasting expertise. You need my knowledge." Elias was implementing his desperate contingency, creating a false lure. He was diverting their attention far from the true Serpent's Head lode. Buying time for Wamsuta to file the claim, Shaw exchanged a skeptical look with Garrick. "Where is this compass?" Elias pointed vaguely toward the northern trail. "I lost it 2 days ago. The fever, it points right to it. If you search for it now, you might find it before the snow buries it forever." Garrick, ever driven by the shortest route to massive wealth, felt the lure. He wanted the copper, not a fight with a half-dead clerk. The possibility of finding the compass a direct map to the mother lode was too tempting. "We'll deal with the papers later." "Shaw," Garrick snapped, his eyes already fixed on the northwest ridge. "Let's find that compass. Thorn here is no threat now. He won't survive the night." Garrick mounted his horse. Shaw lingered, looking at Elias with cold disappointment. "You are foolish, Thorn. You could have surrendered and lived. Now you are just delaying your inevitable cold end." Garrick and Shaw rode off toward the difficult, exposed northwest ridge a fool's errand, leading them far from the true prize. Elias slumped back against his shelter, the adrenaline draining away, replaced by the crushing exhaustion of the fever. He had survived the first winter storm, the hunger, and the illness. He had faced his enemy and managed to sow the seeds of deceit. But the test of his will was far from over. He was alone, gravely ill, and now he had to survive long enough for Wamsuta's journey to conclude. The dead of the old world had sent him across an ocean. The brutality of the new world was demanding his life. Elias Thorn survived the immediate aftermath of Garrick and Shaw's visit, but the victory was purely tactical. The severe fever, combined with the extreme cold of the winter deep, left him perilously weak. He knew Garrick and Shaw would eventually realize they had been sent on a fool's errand to the exposed northwest ridge. They would return, and Elias needed to be gone. He spent the next 2 weeks recovering just enough strength to pack. The copper lode was sealed under a heavy blanket of snow. His greatest hope lay with Wamsuta and the filed survey. But Elias had no way of knowing. If the Nipmuc guide had survived the journey to Boston, his best chance was to leave the isolated claim and seek shelter and sustenance in the nearest permanent English settlement, a small, devout Puritan village named Hearthwood, located several days' ride to the southeast. The risk of exposing himself was immense, but the alternative was certain death by starvation or exposure. Arreeing Bess and concealing the copper compass deeper within his pack. Elias rode for 4 days, pushing his weak body to its limit. He arrived at Hearthwood in the dead of winter, a cluster of grim, clapboard buildings huddled against the vast, unforgiving forest. Hearthwood was dominated by a stark meeting house and the severe moral authority of its elder, Deacon Josiah Blackwood. This was a community built on piety, suspicion, and a rigid adherence to biblical law, stark contrast to the transactional society Elias had left in London. Elias presented himself as a stranded surveyor, delayed by the early winter, seeking food, lodging, and a chance to replenish his supplies before returning to Boston. Deacon Blackwood, a man with cold, penetrating eyes and a thin, severe face, greeted Elias with a deep, unsettling suspicion. A surveyor, you say? With the weather turning so foul, God's wrath is upon those who linger in the wilderness for worldly gain. Mr. Thorne. Elias offered a modest amount of silver for his stay, enough to secure him a small, frigid room in the communal house and a place at the common table. Elias's presence immediately caused a ripple of unease in the tightly knit settlement. He was an outsider, educated, well-spoken, and, crucially, he carried the aura of the wild, untamed land, a land the Puritan settlers viewed as the dominion of the devil and the savage natives. The suspicion quickly focused on Elias's possessions. His large, precise brass transit and his unfamiliar, copper-encased compass were viewed with fear. The internal conflict within the settlement was a slow-burning fire of religious fervor and hardship. Hearthwood had suffered a lean harvest, several mysterious deaths among the livestock, and a pervasive sense of dread. The community was seeking a cause, a scapegoat, for their misfortune. The seed of paranoia was sown by Mistress Abigail Sims, a widowed woman known for her hysteria and extreme piety. She observed Elias closely, unnerved by his pale complexion, a remnant of his fever. His occasional mutterings in delirium and his secretive habits. Elias dared not reveal the true copper compass, so he frequently checked his mundane brass compass. One evening, during the communal prayer service, Abigail stood up and pointed a shaking finger at Elias. Deacon Blackwood, that man, he carries the devil's instrument, a compass that points not to God's north, but to a dark place. I saw him whispering to it in the moonlight. The community stared at Elias. The deacon's gaze was lethal. Deacon Blackwood summoned Elias the next morning. "Show me this instrument, Mr. Thorne. The one Mistress Sims claims is an agent of Satan." Elias presented his ordinary brass surveying compass, trying to remain calm. "It is a surveyor's tool, Deacon. It points magnetic north, a function of God's own creation." Blackwood dismissed the brass tool with a wave of his hand. "There is another, a copper one. My daughter saw it. Strange metal, unmarked." Elias froze. How could they know? He realized he had been careless during his fever, perhaps having accidentally exposed the copper compass when he was delirious and alone. He was forced to produce the unique, ancient copper compass. Blackwood held the copper device, his expression turning to ice. "It points southwest by west," he noted, turning it slowly. "It does not point true north. It points to the savage country, to the dark forests." "What unholy destination does this sorcery guide you to, Thorne?" The deacon's voice boomed. The people of Hearthwood gathered outside the meeting house, listened to the confrontation with rising dread. Elias struggled to explain. "It is an artifact, Deacon, an old navigational tool. It is merely magnetized to a geological anomaly, perhaps a deposit of iron ore in the earth. I am a surveyor seeking to lay a claim, not a sorcerer." His intellectual scientific explanation was the worst possible defense. It confirmed their fears. Geological anomaly sounded like a pact with the earth spirits. Magnetized sounded like unnatural manipulation. The devil often works through the appearance of earthly knowledge, Blackwood thundered. You speak of iron and ore, but we speak of God. You come from the corrupt world of London, bringing your sickness and your strange, silent ally. The accusations spiraled rapidly into full-blown panic. Elias was placed in the settlement's small, freezing stockade. The community's internal conflict, their religious extremism, and their desperate search for blame was, violently, projected onto the defenseless outsider. The crisis reached its peak when several children, encouraged by Abigail Sims, claimed to have been pinched and tormented by Elias's familiar a fabricated event straight out of the infamous Salem trials. Elias was brought before a spontaneous, panicked court composed of Deacon Blackwood and 2 other elders. The atmosphere was charged with religious hysteria. The deacon laid the copper compass on the table. You will confess to making league with Satan, Thorn, that you might be purified before the rope is drawn. Elias realized the true nature of the societal breakdown. These people were not inherently evil. They were terrified. They were clinging to their faith against an environment that was actively trying to kill them. He knew a confession meant a quick death by hanging. Denying it meant a more painful, prolonged trial and eventual execution. He made his final, critical choice. He would not confess, but he would turn the tables. Using their own language of fear against them, Elias lifted his head, despite the crushing weakness, and looked directly at Deacon Blackwood. I am not in league with the devil, Deacon, but I know the work of a demon when I see it. The crowd gasped. The sickness, the crop failure, the livestock deaths. Elias continued, his voice surprisingly strong. It is not sorcery you face. It is greed. I was driven here by a man whose soul is blackened by Avrissa, man who seeks to destroy this entire region for a mine of metal. He pointed to the copper compass. This is a marker. It points to a great copper lode. My true enemy, Silas Kett, has sent a demon of his own, a man named Garrick, to find this compass and kill anyone who stands in his way. Garrick is the one who trespasses on this sacred ground. Garrick is the one who will bring violence, theft, and eternal ruin to Hearthwood, not the devil. Elias was gambling everything on the faint hope that the Puritan fear of an aggressive, godless, purely commercial entity Kett, Garrick might supersede their fear of abstract witchcraft. Deacon Blackwood hesitated, his severe eyes searching Elias's face. The accusation of a worldly evil, the rapacious greed of a powerful man, seeking to ruin their colony, struck a different chord. The colonists were already politically resentful of distant English control. The societal breakdown paused. The internal conflict of Hearthwood now had an external, recognizable human enemy. The crisis was interrupted by a violent commotion outside. The heavy wooden door burst open, and Jedediah Shaw, his face grimed and frozen, stumbled in, followed by a thoroughly enraged and bruised Garrick. They were exhausted, having returned from their fruitless search on the northwest ridge, furious and exposed by the cold. There he is. Garrick roared, pointing his rifle at Elias. The trespassing snake. He misled us. He tried to steal Kett's claim. Garrick's blatant aggression, his armed intrusion into the meeting house, and his loud, profane declaration of worldly greed accomplished what Elias's words could not. Garrick's physical presence confirmed Elias's warning. The true threat to Hearthwood was not an invisible demon, but the aggressive, land-hungry, and lawless brutality of the old world's agents. Deacon Blackwood, faced with the contrast between the weak, well-spoken Elias and the menacing, aggressive Garrick, made his final judgment. You speak of Kett, Blackwood said, pointing the copper compass toward Garrick. You bring violence to our sacred place. He pointed to Elias. The surveyor will remain confined, but alive. He is our witness. You too, stand down. You will respect the king's law and the authority of Hearthwood, or you will answer to God's own justice in this settlement." Elias collapsed in exhaustion, saved not by his innocence, but by the timely, violent arrogance of his enemies. The settlement's paranoia had temporarily found a more satisfying target. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the fate of the claim and the soul of the settlement. The dramatic confrontation in the Hearthwood meeting house had achieved two things. It saved Elias Thorne from the noose, but it also trapped him in the settlement's custody. Garrick and Shaw, though furious, were equally immobilized. Deacon Blackwood, fearing the external threat of Ket's powerful agents more than the internal threat of Elias's supposed sorcery, held all three men under house arrest, awaiting a magistrate's review from Boston, a review that the winter snows made impossible for weeks. Elias, though physically weak, was mentally sharp. He knew he had bought time, but not freedom. Garrick and Shaw were confined to a separate cabin, nursing their rage and waiting for Ket's deadline to pass, at which point the foreclosure would be complete, rendering Elias's claim moot. Regardless of Wamsita's journey, his immediate need was to escape and secure an alternative means of income. He needed money to fight Ket's foreclosure legally. Even if Wamsita succeeded in filing the claim, Elias found an unlikely ally within Hearthwood, Martha Davies, the community's quiet, pragmatic midwife and herb gatherer. Martha was older, hardened by life, and possessed a cynicism about Puritan zeal that she kept carefully concealed. She was the one who tended to Elias after the fever, smuggling him pine bark broth and speaking to him in low, secular whispers. One frigid evening, while bringing him a thin gruel, Martha leaned close. "Deacon Blackwood's faith is strong, Mr. Thorne, but his vision is narrow. He fears the wilderness and the devil, but the king's taxes and the empty larder are real, present dangers." "I have copper," Elias whispered back. "A profound gamble. Enough to make this settlement rich, but I cannot move it legally. I need money, Martha, to defend the claim." Martha's eyes, usually tired, gleamed with sudden, calculated interest. "The law ends where the trees begin, Mr. Thorne. And in this colony, what the king doesn't see. The king can't tax." Martha revealed the existence of the secret economy, the lifeblood of frontier survival under the oppressive British excise taxes. Due to the restrictive navigation acts and crippling duties imposed by the Crown, most peripheral colonial settlements relied on smuggling to obtain essential goods like tea, molasses, finished iron tools, and textiles. Bypassing the official ports of Boston and Plymouth, Martha knew of a hidden rendezvous point on the coast, nearly 40 miles east of Hearthwood, known simply as the Cove. It was a desolate, tide-swept inlet accessible only by experienced coastal sailors and smugglers. A small vessel, usually Dutch or French, made a dangerous run there once a month during the cold weather, trading essential contraband for colonial staples. "They're due in 5 days," Martha warned. "They bring iron. You have copper. Barter is their language. But the path is perilous, and the smugglers are ruthless." The proposition was a profound moral compromise for Elias. He was a man of contracts and law, forced by his predicament into a legal activity. However, the debt he owed Ket was rooted in theft and corruption. Fighting Ket required fire with fire. Smuggling was no greater evil than Ket's avarice, and it was a necessary step toward his ultimate freedom. "I need a guide, and I need to move the copper samples," Elias said. "And I need a way to get past Garrick and Shaw." Martha, fueled by a desire to secure resources for her struggling community and, perhaps, a share of Elias's future, Fortune agreed to the task, securing him an escape route. The escape was planned for the dead of night. Martha's grandson, a silent, agile boy named Caleb, used the diversion of a minor fire on the edge of the settlement to draw the few guards away. Elias, though still weak, Moved with a renewed purpose, he slipped past the locked cabin where Garrick and Shaw were confined. Feeling a savage satisfaction in leaving them trapped, he retrieved Bess from the deacon's stable, along with the hidden copper compass and the heavy bag of high-grade copper samples. Caleb led Elias through a barely discernible deer track until they reached a dilapidated wagon provided by Martha. Elias strapped the bag of ore to the wagon and began the grueling, solitary journey east. The meeting at the cove was tense and furtive. Elias arrived just before midnight, the air thick with salt spray and the smell of seaweed. A small sloop, the Silent Maid, was anchored offshore, its sails furled. A longboat pulling toward the dark beach. The leader of the smugglers was a formidable French-Canadian named Jacques Dubois, a man with a face like rough granite and an eye for quality goods. Dubois looked at Elias, the refined Londoner in crude frontier clothes, with cynical amusement. "You trespass where you do not belong, monsieur. What is the price of this late-night desperation?" Elias didn't waste time. He opened the bag, revealing the glistening, heavy copper ore. High-grade copper sulfide. Raw, virgin ore. The highest quality on the Atlantic. "I need immediate payment gold or hard silver coin and enough essential iron tools to return and begin a larger extraction." Dubois picked up a sample, tested its weight, and chipped off a piece with his knife. His eyes widened slightly. This was indeed a find. "This is dangerous wealth, Angley," Dubois warned, glancing at the surrounding darkness. "If the king's cutters found us with this, we would all hang." The negotiation was brutal. Elias, weakened and desperate, was forced to accept a fraction of the ore's true value. But he secured what he desperately needed, 500 gold sovereigns, enough to pay Ket a significant portion of the original detan, a load of crucial iron goods, shovels, picks, and blasting powder, a highly illegal commodity. The transaction involved two significant moral compromises. Funding illegality. Elias knowingly funded a network that undermined the king's government, the very authority he needed to uphold his land claim. Selling the seed corn, he sold the very samples that could have been his proof of claim to a foreign buyer, forcing him to rely entirely on the unfettered load at the Serpent's Head for his ultimate success. But the gold sovereigns, heavy and cold in his hand, represented the only way out of Ket's grip. It was a necessary evil. Elias returned to the Hearthwood area, hiding his wagon and gold in a deep snow-covered ravine not far from the settlement. He knew he could not risk returning to Hearthwood itself. He was now a wanted man by Garrick and Shaw, and potentially by the king's authorities for engaging in smuggling. He was a man caught between three worlds: the lawless wilderness, the Puritan zealotry, and the king's restrictive law. He had one last task before heading back to the claim. He had to fulfill his oath to Martha and the settlement, under cover of darkness. Elias used Caleb to transport the essential iron tools and supplies axes, grain, and bolts of fabric hemmed to Hearthwood. He included a generous amount of valuable tea and molasses, contraband that would sustain the community through the cruelest part of the winter. He left a note for Martha. "The oath is honored. The iron is yours. The mountain is safe. Tell the deacon that the only witchcraft here is the greed of men, and it must be fought with the will of free people." Elias realized that his journey had forced a fundamental shift in his character. The London clerk had been rigid, lawful, and ultimately powerless. The new Elias Thorne was pragmatic, morally flexible, and capable of using illegal means to achieve a just end his freedom. He headed back toward the Serpent's Head, the gold heavy in his pack, the smell of gunpowder from the smuggled powder cask tainting the clean air, and the copper compass leading him onward. He was ready to face Garrick again, not as a helpless fever victim, but as a financed rival who had just plunged his hands into the secret, muddy waters of the colonial economy. The battle for the claim was now fully funded. Elias Thorne returned to the vicinity of his claim, a changed man. The gold sovereigns from his illicit deal at the Smuggler's Cove were now safely hidden. A war chest against Ket. The smuggled iron tools and blasting powder provided the means to actively mine the copper lode. And the harsh lessons of the wilderness had replaced his London naivete with frontier pragmatism. The most critical factor, however, was Wamsuta. After nearly a month of agonizing doubt, Elias received a silent signal of feather tied in a specific knot to a trail. Marker near the serpent's head, Wamsuta had returned. The meeting was brief and conducted with intense secrecy. Wamsuta confirmed the successful, though dangerous, journey to Boston. He had managed to file Elias's detailed survey and the deed with the Colonial Land Registry, honoring the oath by including the Nipmuc covenant over the mountain's blood. Ket's deadline had been met. Elias's legal claim was now secured, temporarily preempting Ket's foreclosure. The claim is filed, Wamsuta whispered. But the fire in Boston is growing. The English king asks for much. The people speak of rebellion. Wamsuta's words confirmed Elias's own observations. The political climate in the colonies, already volatile, was nearing a breaking point. The recent imposition of the Stamp Act 1765 by the British Parliament, combined with the stringent enforcement of the Navigation Acts that crippled colonial trade, had ignited a widespread, bitter resentment among merchants, farmers, and laborers alike. Elias saw the parallels between his personal struggle and the colony's political one. He was fighting a private tyranny, Ket's debt and avarice, while the colonists were fighting a public one, the crown's taxation without representation. Both struggles centered on the fundamental right to the fruits of one's own labor and land. He began to notice the shift in the few travelers he encountered. The traditional loyalty to the crown was fracturing, replaced by a fierce, protective localism. The settlers no longer spoke of the king's goodwill. They spoke of liberty to maintain the secrecy of the copper lode and gather intelligence on Garrick. Elias spent the next few weeks cautiously frequenting isolated taverns and trading posts further north, posing as an itinerant surveyor. These were the true crucibles of colonial unrest. In the smoky, low-ceilinged rooms, the atmosphere was electric. Arguments over pints of ale were no longer about crop yields. They were debates over parliamentary sovereignty. Elias listened as local leaders, often farmers or blacksmiths, articulated the growing resentment. The crown takes our trade, restricts our markets, and then demands we pay taxes on the very paper we use to write our deeds. They choke us on one hand and starve us on the other. Elias understood this. His own predicament was due to an unfair, inherited debt that a distant, powerful authority Ket, backed by London's system, was trying to enforce to confiscate his hard-won property. He was a micro-reflection of the macro-colonial struggle. The political unrest soon became a direct tactical challenge to Elias, Garrick, and Shaw. Now, out of confinement in Hearthwood, and aware that Elias's claim had been legally filed, shifted their strategy. They could no longer use foreclosure. They had to challenge the legitimacy of the claim in court to fight Elias's legal standing. Garrick decided to frame Elias as an enemy of the crown. Garrick began spreading vicious rumors in the taverns that tore with four mailles, that Elias Thorne was not merely a surveyor, but a seditionist, a radical firebrand from London who was using the wilderness as a base to organize anti-crown resistance. Funded by French smugglers, a half-truth that was dangerously plausible given Elias's recent trade. Garrick's ploy was simple and cruel. If Elias could be painted as a political radical and an insurrectionist, the British authorities would arrest him, nullify his land claim, and hand the copper lode over to Ket, whom Garrick would present as a loyal, upstanding royal contractor. The tension peaked with the arrival of tax collector Silas Crowley to the Northern District. Crowley was a pompous, deeply unpopular official known for his rigid adherence to the Stamp Act and his punitive seizure of colonial property to settle tax debts. Garrick and Qua saw their opportunity. They intercepted Crowley on his route and deliberately fed him the fabricated story of Elias Thorne, the smuggling seditionist hiding near the Nipmuc lands. Garrick offered to guide Crowley and a small contingent of provincial militia directly to Elias's supposed revolutionary base near the Palisades. Crowley, eager to make a high-profile arrest to prove his diligence to the crown, agreed. Elias received a frantic warning from Martha Davies, who had risked leaving Hearthwood. Crowley rides north. He seeks the smuggler Thorne on charges of sedition and tax evasion. Garrick rides with him, guiding them straight to your land. Elias realized the gravity of his situation. He was about to be caught between a colonial militia loyal to the crown and his relentless, murderous rival, Garrick. The charge of sedition was a hanging offense, and if Crowley arrested him, the claim would be seized by the crown, and Ket would acquire the land anyway. Elias had to make a swift, devastating choice. Should he flee and abandon his claim and the Nipmuc oath, or should he stand and fight, turning his personal defense into a direct act of political defiance against the crown's corrupt system? He chose the latter. He rode quickly to meet with Sachem Kitchenet. Elias laid out the situation plainly. The king's man comes. He is guided by Garrick. They will not only seize my land, but will challenge your sovereignty over the mountain. They will see you as a part of my sedition. Kitchenet listened, his face grave. The Nipmuc had watched the simmering conflict between the colonists and the crown with wary detachment, viewing both sides as unwelcome foreign powers. But Garrick's presence, known aggressor, whose goal was the catastrophic mining of their sacred mountain, forced their hand. The king's law is a circle of lies. Anglais, Kitchenet stated, his voice ringing with authority. But the oath of the mountain is sacred. The king's man, Crowley, comes to take. Garrick comes to ruin. We fight the ruin. Kitchenet made his decision, aligning the Nipmuc survival with Elias's fight for his claim. The chief recognized that Garrick's private greed was a more immediate, destructive threat than the crown's distant taxation. The Nipmuc warriors would not fight for the king, nor for the English colonists' liberty. They would fight to defend their land and their oath to keep the copper secret. Elias had managed to merge his personal battle with the growing road to rebellion. He had the support of the indigenous people and the tools of the smuggler. He was no longer just a clerk fighting a debt. He was a revolutionary in the making, defending his property against the tyranny of both personal avarice and imperial overreach. He returned to the Serpent's Head. He loaded the smuggled powder, prepared his rifle, and waited. The whispers of liberty and taxation were about to erupt into the sound of gunfire on his claim, a sound that would mark not only his final stand against Ket, but his irreversible commitment to the New World's burgeoning rebellion. The intelligence was clear. Tax collector Silas Crowley, guided by Garrick and accompanied by 5 heavily armed members of the provincial militia, was expected to reach the vicinity of the Palisades within 48 hours. Their mission was simple: arrest Elias Thorne for sedition and seize his claim as crown property, thus handing the copper load by default. To Silas Ket's agents, Elias had prepared his defense at the Serpent's Head, the heart of the copper claim. It was an exposed position, but tactically valuable due to the sheer rock face of the Palisades behind him, limiting the direction of any attack. He was fortified with his smuggled iron tools and, crucially, the barrel of blasting powder obtained at the Smuggler's Cove. Elias was not alone. Sachem Kitchenet had honored his oath, viewing the crown's encroachment, guided by the destructive Garrick, as a direct threat to the Nipmuc's fragile sovereignty. Wamsuta and 6 other Nipmuc warriors armed with bows, arrows, and a few scavenged muskets bartered from French traders positioned themselves silently in the dense cover surrounding the stream leading up to the Serpent's Head. Their strategy, formulated by Elias and Wamsuta, was not a pitched battle, but a devastating, precise ambush tactic Elias had learned from Wamsuta's deep knowledge of the terrain. They aimed to neutralize the threat without engaging in a prolonged fight. That would surely result in the annihilation of their small force. Garrick, driven by revenge and greed, was predictable. He would push the militia hard. Wanting to secure the arrest before any legal countermove could be made from Boston, the attack came not in the light of day, but under the shield of a moonless, frigid night. Around midnight, the stillness of the wilderness was broken by the muffled sounds of men moving cautiously through the frozen undergrowth. Garrick, taking the lead, was stealthy, but the heavy, iron-shod boots of the militiamen were not. Elias, perched behind a barricade of stacked logs and rock near the entrance to his excavated load site, watched the shadows coalesce. He recognized the imposing frame of Garrick, followed closely by Shaw and Crowley, the latter huddled in a thick coat, clearly uncomfortable with the midnight pursuit. Garrick paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the dark rock face. He seemed to sense the trap, but his need for the copper and his fury at Elias overrode his caution. Thorn. Garrick roared into the darkness. "We know you're here, you sniveling coward. You are under arrest by order of the crown. Surrender the land and the seditious papers, and you may face the hangman quickly." Elias's voice was strained, but clear in the cold air. "The land is filed, Garrick. The debt is paid. You are trespassing on a legitimate claim." Garrick signaled the militia to advance. They spread out, their flintlocks raised, moving toward the base of the Serpent's Head. The battle began with the sound of a whip-like cracknot, a musket. But Wamsuta's bow and arrow, tipped with iron, bartered from Elias, struck the lead militiaman in the shoulder. The man cried out, stumbling into the snow. The Nipmuc had achieved the desired effect. Immediate chaos and confusion. The militia opened fire indiscriminately into the woods, the musket shots echoing deafeningly against the palisades. The blinding flashes illuminated the scene, revealing Garrick and Shaw scrambling for cover behind a cluster of boulders. Tax collector Crowley, hysterical, dove into a deep snowdrift. The Nipmuc did not rush. They employed their terrifying knowledge of the terrain, moving from shadow to shadow, firing precise, single shots at the militia's exposed flanks. 2 more militiamen fell. Wounded and disoriented, Elias, meanwhile, focused on his primary target, Garrick. Garrick, realizing his militia was dissolving in panic, began to load his own heavy rifle. He was focused on returning fire toward the woods, failing to notice Elias's position near the rock face. The final gambit, blasting powder. This was the moment for Elias's desperate, high-stakes gamble. Before the attack, Elias had drilled a small, shallow bore into the rock wall directly above the trail the intruders had used to enter the clearing. He had packed this bore with a carefully measured charge of his smuggled blasting powder, running a thin, slow-burning wick down to his position. Elias ignited the wick. It spat and sparked, burning rapidly toward the charge. He aimed his fowling piece at Garrick and fired. The shot went wide. Elias's aim was poor, but the distraction was enough. "Look up, Garrick," Elias shouted. Garrick looked up just as the powder charge detonated. It was not a huge explosion. Elias had not used enough powder for that, but it was loud and perfectly placed. The blast dislodged the precariously balanced, heavy rocks above the trail, sending a shower of debris and snow cascading down into the clearing. Garrick, Shaw, and the remaining militiamen were instantly buried up to their waists in heavy snow and rock debris. The blast served 3 critical functions. neutralizing the enemy. Garrick and his men were incapacitated, buried, and stunned. Psychological warfare. The sound of the explosion terrified the already panicked militia, confirming their belief that they were fighting not just a man, but a supernatural or fanatical force. A show of force. It demonstrated Elias's intent and his possession of illegal, high-grade powder. It's a clear signal that this claim would be defended by any means necessary. Wamsuda and the Nipmuc warriors quickly closed in on the trapped men, their bows drawn. Elias emerged from his barricade, his face grim, the smell of sulfur and gunpowder stinging the cold air. Garrick struggled free of the snow, his face pale with fury and shock. He realized he was surrounded, his weapons lost or buried. Tax collector Crowley, pulled from the snowdrift by a Nipmuc warrior, was shivering uncontrollably. Sedition. Treason. This is an act of war against the king. Elias walked directly to Crowley, stepping over the prone body of a wounded militiaman. He took the tax collector's freezing hand, pulling him up. "It is an act of self-defense, Mr. Crowley," Elias said, his voice calm and firm. "Against the treasonous greed of Silas Kett and his agent. Your men attacked first, on the basis of a lie fabricated by the very man beside you." He pointed to Garrick. "Your warrant is invalid. I am a free citizen defending my legally filed claim against criminal intrusion." Garrick struggled to intervene, but Wamsuda pressed a knife to his throat. Elias presented Crowley with the ultimate choice. "You can arrest me now for sedition, nullify my claim, and risk your life and the lives of your remaining men in the middle of a Nipmuc ambush, only to hand this land to Kett, an enemy of the people." He then lowered his voice. "Or you can take Garrick and Shaw back to Boston. You can present them as the true culprits agents of a London profiteer who impersonated the Crown's authority to seize property and who fired upon the peaceful Nipmuc nation, risking full-scale colonial war." Crowley, defeated, frozen, and facing the silent, lethal presence of the Nipmuc, made the pragmatic choice. The whispers of liberty had been stronger than the king's authority. "They are under arrest," Crowley croaked, pointing a shaking finger at Garrick and Shaw, for impersonating the Crown's authority and assaulting the native people. The midnight raid was over. Elias had won the confrontation, not by superior force, but by superior strategy, alliance, and the calculated use of fear and contraband. Garrick and Shaw were bound and led away by the battered militia, watched by the silent. Victorious NIPMUC. Elias stood alone beside the serpent's head, the copper compass still hidden in his jacket, the smell of gunpowder fresh in the air. He had transformed from a debtor into a defender, willing to use smuggling and explosives to uphold his claim. The price of the New World's freedom was a readiness to embrace the necessary evils of rebellion. The personal fight against Kett was now irrevocably entangled with the colonists' fight for liberty. The immediate victory at the Serpent's Head was hard won, but decisive. Garrick and Shaw were gone, marching back toward Boston under the reluctant custody of tax collector Crowley and his shattered militia. Elias Thorne had successfully defended his claim against Kett's armed agents, but the victory was temporary and brought a chilling personal cost. The confrontation had confirmed the political commitment of Elias to the burgeoning colonial resistance, a path that would soon put him in direct opposition to the last person he ever expected to face, his own cousin. Julian Thorne, 3rd weeks after the midnight raid. As the harsh grip of deep winter began to slightly loosen, Elias was alone at his fortified camp, meticulously planning the extraction of the copper lode. The Nipmuc had retreated deeper into the woods to wait out the coldest weather, leaving Wamsuda as Elias's sole link to the alliance. A lone rider appeared on the eastern trail, struggling through the thawing snow. The rider was well-dressed, mounted on a fine, imported thoroughbred, and looked utterly out of place in the wilderness. It was Julian Thorne, Elias's cousin, who had served as a captain in the Royal Engineers and was currently attached to the command staff in New York. Julian was everything. Elias had once been and failed to be. Polished, confident, and deeply entrenched in the old world's power structure. They had grown up like siblings, sharing tutors and aspirations, until Elias's family debt and Julian's military career had pulled them onto divergent paths. Julian dismounted, his expensive leather boots sinking into the mud. He looked at Elias's rough, fur-lined clothing, the rifle resting nearby, and the scarred, serious expression on Elias's face. "Elias," Julian said, his voice laced with shock and disappointment. "What in God's name have you become? I heard the rumors edition, fighting the Crown's militia, consorting with savages and smugglers. I rode hard to reach you before the official warrant did." The reunion was not one of warmth, but of ideological battle. Julian had come not to save Elias, but to extract him, offering a path back to legitimacy through military channels, a loyalty plea to the Crown. They settled near the fire, the vast, silent wilderness serving as the courtroom for their argument. Julian, the loyalist, Julian viewed the colonial resistance as dangerous, self-serving anarchy that threatened the ordered peace and established law of the British Empire. "This is madness, Elias. You have filed a legitimate claim. We can use my position to expedite the court process. But you must renounce this rebellion. The Crown offers structure, stability, and the protection of the greatest military force on earth. These farmers and artisans you consort with, they are selfish, ignorant of the grand order. Ket is a rogue, yes, but the law must prevail, even if it is slow. Defying the king is treason, and it will destroy everything we grew up believing in. Elias." The pragmatic rebel, Elias, saw the Crown as a tool for the powerful like Ket to perpetuate injustice and economic slavery. His own transformation had been driven by the need to fight corruption with action, bypassing a legal system that had failed him. You speak of order and law, Julian, but whose law? Ket uses your Crown's laws to steal and murder. I was drowning in a London debt the law could not solve. The only thing that saved this claim and my life was defying the Crown's agent. The grand order you defend exists only to benefit those who sit comfortably in London, while the people here starve under impossible taxes. Julian produced a letter and official royal commission. I have secured you an offer, Elias. Sign this document, affirming your loyalty to the Crown, and I can arrange for the immediate military protection of your claim while the court handles. Ket, you will be cleared of sedition. You will be rich. You will be safe. Elias looked at the document, the temptation strong. It was the easy way out to return to the world of recognized status and security. But it required him to betray every difficult, painful choice he had made in the wilderness, and worse, to betray his oath to the Nipmuc and Wamsuta and Kitchkanet. They fought for this land, for my claim, against your Crown's men. Will your king protect them from the wave of greedy white men that will surely follow? Will the law protect them when their spirit herbs are cut down for timber profits? Julian hesitated, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The law is slow, Elias, but the military protects British subjects, the Indians. They must learn to adapt to the king's order. Adapt or be destroyed, Elias challenged. He pointed to the copper compass, which he had deliberately placed near the fire, revealing its strange, un-British design. This is what guides me now, Julian. Not your king's maps, but the promise of a place where a man can be free of the old world's debt and the old world's shadow. I will not trade one master for another. The duel of the failure to convince Elias hardened Julian's resolve. He was no longer trying to save his cousin. He was trying to save the principles that defined his life. Then you leave me no choice, Julian said, rising slowly. I cannot allow a known seditionist, who is actively engaged in an armed attack on the king's authority, to possess a strategic resource like the copper lode. You are a danger to the entire colony. As an officer of the crown, I must seize the claim and hold you for treason. Julian drew the beautiful, highly polished officer's rapier he carried, the steel gleaming in the firelight. Fight me, Elias. Surrender the claim by force. And at least I can tell the court you were defending yourself against arrest. It is the best I can offer a traitor. Elias stood up. He did not possess a gentleman's sword. He picked up his primary weapon of the wilderness, his rough, heavy-duty hunting knife, made for skinning and cutting, not for dueling. The ensuing fight was not elegant. It was a desperate clash of opposing lifestyles and ideals. Julian, trained in the precise, formal European art of fencing, was superior in skill. Elias, fueled by desperation, rage, and the brutal survival instincts learned in the wilderness, was unpredictable. Julian's rapier sliced the air with deadly precision, representing the ordered, beautiful, yet ultimately rigid power of the empire. Elias ducked and countered with clumsy, powerful lunges, his knife representing the savage, pragmatic necessity of the frontier. The fight ended swiftly. Julian, overconfident, lunged for a decisive thrust. Elias, leveraging his position against the rugged terrain, sidestepped and drove the butt of his heavy hunting rifle into Julian's ribs. Julian gasped, his concentration broken. Elias did not stab him. He knocked the rapier from Julian's hand, the steel clattering uselessly against the rock. Elias stood over his cousin, the knife raised. "Do you still defend the law, Julian?" Elias spat. "When it is used to murder your own kin." Julian, gasping for breath, looked up at Elias, not with fear, but with profound sadness. "You have traded your soul for earth, Elias. You have chosen the path of chaos. I grieve for the man you were." Elias lowered the knife. He could not kill him. The bond of blood, however, stretched by ideology, held. "Go back, Julian," Elias said, his voice heavy with finality. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them the copper is protected by men who believe in something greater than a king's tax. I do not fight the crown because I hate order. I fight it because I seek justice. And justice here is earned through defiance, not decree." Elias returned Julian's horse and supplies. Julian, beaten and spiritually defeated, rode away, his uniform stained with mud, his ideals shattered by the brutal reality of the frontier. The duel of ideals was over. Elias had won the physical battle, but he had lost his brother. The fight had confirmed his irreversible commitment to the colonial cause. He had chosen the uncertain path of liberty, the chaotic honesty of the frontier. Over the ordered tyranny of the empire, he was now wholly committed to defending the copper lode, not just as his own property, but as a symbolic resource for the nascent American rebellion. The next step was not defense, but action, the final bold step of extracting the fortune that had cost him everything. The departure of Julian Thorne marked the end of Elias's personal conflicts with the Old World's agents. Garrick was in custody. His cousin was riding toward a future of disillusionment, and the colonial claim was legally filed. Elias was finally free to focus entirely on the central purpose of his desperate journey, the extraction of the copper lode. This was the climax of his financial struggle, the moment the inherited debt would either be vanquished by fortune or seal his ruin. The deep winter had finally yielded to the harsh, muddy thaw of the early colonial spring. This was the time for action. Elias, assisted by Wamsuta and a handful of Nipmuc men hired with the promise of iron tools, returned to the Serpent's Head. The true work of mining began. Elias put his smuggled tools to use: the heavy picks, the shovels, and the precious barrel of blasting powder. Following the French cartography etched in his memory, the point exactly 300 paces north of the Serpent's Head formation began to clear the thick layer of earth, and Wamsuta's men were efficient. utilizing their profound knowledge of the rock and soil to assist. Elias, guided by the copper compass which, now that he was at the source, seemed to vibrate with a constant, low-grade energy, directed the labor. The Nipmuc viewed the work with grim curiosity. They honored their oath, but Kitchkinet's warning remained. The metal burns the heart. The initial digging revealed a promising, rich seam of copper sulfide, exactly as the samples had suggested. But it was only a surface expression, shallow vein that would quickly exhaust itself. Ket's valuation of the land must have been based on something far greater. Elias needed to find the mother lode, the massive, deep deposit that the French surveyor had written about and that Ket so desperately coveted. He believed the copper compass, with its fixed southwest B-west pointing, was not merely indicating the location, but the direction of the richest seam. He took his blasting powder and, guided by the compass's direction, drilled a series of deep holes into the rock face along the indicated vector. This was a dangerous, loud, and legally questionable activity, but necessary to penetrate the hard outer shell of the earth. He loaded the charges and retreated with Wamsuta to a safe distance. The resulting blast was tremendous, echoing across the Palisades, a sound of both destruction and creation. When the smoke cleared, Elias rushed back, heart pounding. The explosion had cleaved open a large section of the rock face. The initial disappointment was crushing. The blast had revealed only more slate and granite. Elias knelt in the dust, defeated. He had risked everything: his life, his freedom, his Cousin, a forgotten piece of parchment, and a strange copper compass. Had the French surveyor been wrong? Had Ket's intelligence been flawed? Wamsuta, however, noticed something Elias had overlooked in his despair. He pointed to the rubble field left by the explosion. "Not rock angly," Wamsuta said, his voice quiet. "Something else." Elias looked closely, where the blast had ripped open the earth. The debris was laced with veins of metallic material that was not the greenish-blue copper sulfide he expected. It was a dense reddish-gold rock mixed with a crystalline white mineral. It looked heavy, almost impossibly so. Elias took a sample. He scraped it with his knife. It was hard, resisting the blade. It was not copper. He held it up to the pale spring light, the sun catching the hidden metal within. The color was unmistakable. It was native gold. The discovery was dizzying. Elias fell back against the rock, stunned. Ket had been obsessed with the copper, a valuable industrial commodity, but the lode was infinitely richer. The copper seam had been merely the capstone, the geological signpost for a vast underlying deposit of gold-laced quartz. The realization hit him with the force of the blast itself. The true treasure was not the copper for industry, but gold for currency. This deposit was vast, virgin, and potentially the richest discovered in the colonies. The true meaning of the copper compass suddenly became clear. It had not pointed to the copper, had pointed to the massive iron deposit that lay beneath the gold vein, creating the unique magnetic anomaly that guided the compass. His great-uncle, the scholar, had not found copper, but had created a specific, secret compass to point to the enormous magnetic field generated by the underlying gold-iron concentration. The copper compass was not a map to a hidden debt. It was a key to unimaginable fortune. The discovery of the gold lode immediately and irrevocably changed everything. The financial battle, the gold removed all financial limits. Elias was no longer fighting merely to pay a few £1,000s of inherited debt. He was now capable of becoming one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, able to crush Ket in court with superior capital and by the political influence necessary to protect his claim. The political stakes, the value of the claim, had just multiplied by orders of magnitude. Copper was vital. Gold was revolutionary. If this news became public, It would not just attract Ket, but the direct, massive intervention of the British Crown, which would view such a vast gold deposit as belonging automatically to the king. The struggle would escalate from a local skirmish to a matter of imperial priority. The nascent road to rebellion could be fueled or crushed by this fortune. The personal test. Kitchenett's warning echoed. The metal burns the heart. Elias had successfully fought greed, but now he held the ultimate source of human avarice. Could he keep his oath to the Nipmuc when faced with the power that gold represented? Could he remain a pragmatist when he was suddenly holding the key to a king's fortune? Elias quickly recovered his composure. He knew the peril. The secret of the gold had to be protected even more fiercely than the secret of the copper. He ordered Wamsuta and the Nipmuc to immediately recover the blast site. Using the iron tools to dig only enough of the original copper seemed to justify the sound of the explosion. The gold samples were wrapped in the deepest layers of his pack, secured next to the copper compass itself. Wamsuta, Elias said, his voice hushed with the weight of the secret. The earth has given us more than metal. It has given us power. But the secret must remain between us. The gold must be for the purpose of our freedom and for the preservation of your mountain. The English must only see copper. Wamsuta, watching Elias's face, saw the immense temptation and the conscious struggle to resist it. He nodded slowly. The mountain's blood is strong, Angli. Be careful, it does not flow into your heart. The climax of the story had passed. Elias had not merely found the expected resource. He had found a game-changing, world-altering fortune. The copper compass had fulfilled its final, true destiny as the key. The stage was now set for the final reckoning, where Elias would use the power of the hidden gold to settle the old world's debt and finance the new world's freedom. The silence that followed the discovery of the gold lode was deeper and more profound than any silence Elias Thorne had ever known. It was the heavy quiet of a world fundamentally changed. Elias was no longer merely a debtor fighting for survival. He was a sovereign guarding an immense fortune. He was, by accident of inheritance and design, the richest man in the North Woods. The immediate aftermath was dominated by a brutal, self-imposed solitude and the realization of the immense cost of his victory. Elias and Wamsuta spent the next week meticulously concealing the gold discovery. The rich, vein-laced quartz samples were hidden deep within the Palisades' rock crevices, marked only by the unique direction of the copper compass. They continued the pretense of mining for copper, extracting a few dozen bags of the less valuable ore, to justify the blasting and the ongoing activity on the claim. This period was characterized by paranoia. Elias constantly scanned the tree line, certain that Garrick, if freed from custody, or the Crown, if alerted to the true value of the mine, would descend upon them. The gold was not a comfort. It was a target painted on his back. He accomplished the most critical step. He sent Wamsuta on a second, highly secretive mission, this time with a small, raw gold nugget as proof of his solvency. Wamsuta was to travel to Philadelphia far from the political turmoil of Boston to engage a reputable, discreet banking house. The gold was to be converted into liquid assets in a secure trust, establishing Elias's undeniable financial power for the inevitable legal battle against Ket. Once Wamsuta was gone, Elias was truly alone, confined to his claim by the sheer gravity of his secret. He had defeated his enemies, secured his claim, and found his fortune. But the victory brought not joy, but crushing solitude. The companionship he had found in the shared struggle, the grim alliance with the Nipmuc, the necessary exchanges with Martha Davies, even the duel with his cousin Julian had vanished. He could not trust anyone with the secret of the gold. The burden of the fortune was isolation. He would spend hours sitting at the serpent's head, the copper compass in his hand, staring at the vast, silent wilderness. The cost of freedom. he realized that the freedom he had fought so hard for, freedom from London's debt, came with a new, terrifying obligation. He was now a target for every ambitious man in the colonies. His legal victory was only the first step. The true defense of the load would require constant vigilance, paranoia, and the maintenance of a secret that could shatter the fragile peace of the colony. The cost of kinship, the duel with Julian, haunted him. He had chosen the wilderness ideal over blood and shared history. The cost of his dominion over this land was the loss of his last family tie to the old world. He was an orphan in a new nation, and the wealth could never replace that loss. The moral price he had secured his fortune through illegal trade smuggling and tactical deception, the false load for Garrick. He was rich, but his hands were morally dirtied. He had compromised the purity of the Nipmuc's land by introducing blasting powder and the destructive hunger for gold. Kitchenet's warning, "The metal burns the heart," was a constant echo. One evening, staring into the flickering embers of his solitary fire, Elias found himself examining the material spoils of victory, the physical objects that defined his success. The copper compass, it sat heavy and cold. It was the key to his fortune, yet it represented the debt that had driven him here. It was a relic of his great-uncle's failure, now turned into his personal map of success. The gold samples, these were locked deep within his small strongbox. They were the ultimate prize, but their existence demanded that Elias live a lie, forever concealing the true nature of his wealth. They were a cage of gilded bars. Wamsuta's absence, the silence of the Nipmuc guide, was the greatest cost. Wamsuta was risking his life to secure Elias's fortune, bound only by a promise of iron. Elias realized that the truest measure of his success would not be the gold in his box, but the fulfillment of his oath to the Nipmuc nation. If the gold changed him into the greedy man he despised, the Nipmuc alliance would dissolve, and he would be truly lost. The solitude was finally broken not by an invasion, but by a chilling, subtle reminder that the old world's shadow was long and persistent. One cold afternoon, Elias found a single, heavy package left neatly on his abandoned doorstep near the Serpent's Head. It was wrapped in thick, waterproof oilskin, addressed only to E. Thorne, ESQ. Inside, Elias found a document and a small, sealed tin box. The document was a legal notice of counterclaim filed by the attorneys of Silas Kett. Kett was not appealing the foreclosure. He was filing a massive civil suit for damages and fraudulent conveyance against Elias, using the legal loophole that the original debt had not been paid in full. Only the gold he had sent with Wamsuta would solve that. Kett was not beaten. He was just changing the battleground from the wilderness to the courtroom. The tin box contained a gruesome, chilling message, a perfectly preserved small piece of mahogany wood, carved with the initials JT. The wood was from the antique desk that Julian Thorne had cherished. The message confirmed two terrifying things. Garrick was free. The Crown has released me. Referred to the agent's inevitable freedom due to political necessity. Kett now knew of Julian's visit, indicating that Kett's network of spies was deep and reached even into Julian's staff. Kett was using Julian's emotional vulnerability to threaten Elias. The price of dominion was the constant fear that his victory would lead to the destruction of the man he still considered a brother. Elias now fully understood the cost of his success. The gold was the key, but it was not the end. He was trapped in a perpetual state of vigilance. The spoils of victory were not comfort and ease, but a new, greater burden. He had solved the debt of the past, but he was now burdened with the debt of the future, the debt of preserving his fortune, his life, and the promise he made to the Nipmuc. He took the gold samples and the copper compass. He looked at the Palisades, no longer seeing a defense, but a monumental responsibility. The time for solitude was over. He had the money to fight Kett's lawsuit, but he needed a final decisive action to ensure the gold did not corrupt him or the Nipmuc alliance. He had to leave the claim, return to the political world, and use his new, immense power to permanently secure his land and honor his oath. He had to exchange the wilderness's purity for the city's necessary corruption. The price of dominion was to enter the fray and become a true agent of change. Risking everything to ensure his fortune financed liberty, not just personal gain. The final confrontation was not a clash of muskets, but a battle of ledgers, courtrooms, and political maneuvering. The victory at the Serpent's Head was merely the opening act. With the threat of Silas Kett's massive civil suit looming and the gold lode demanding absolute secrecy, Elias Thorne left the Pine Barrens, carrying his immense burden of wealth and responsibility. Elias did not return to Boston. Guided by Wamsutta's successful mission, he traveled to Philadelphia, a city less embroiled in the immediate political chaos of Massachusetts. There, using the initial gold nugget as collateral, he secured an alliance with the most formidable legal mind in the colonies, a man with known sympathies for colonial self-governance. The ensuing legal duel with Kett's attorneys was fierce. Kett, convinced of Elias's financial weakness, sought to delay the case, tie up the claim in litigation, and force a distress sale. However, Elias's discreetly deployed gold reserves proved overwhelming. He paid the original Thorne debt in full, plus compound interest, nullifying Kett's claims of foreclosure. He then countersued for harassment, trespass, and the cost of defending his property against Garrick's thuggish tactics. The victory was decisive. Kett facing immediate, crushing financial losses and the political embarrassment of having his agent arrested by the Crown's own official Crowley, was forced to settle. The settlement included a permanent relinquishment of all claims to the Thorne land. Elias Thorne was free. Elias returned to the North Woods, no longer as a fugitive or a desperate prospector, but as the uncontested owner of the richest land in the colonies. The price of dominion had been paid, and now came the question of its use. How would he honor the moral compromises, the Nipmuc oath, and the memory of his struggle? He was acutely aware of the risk posed by the gold. Public knowledge would bring the Crown's direct intervention, massive exploitation, and the destruction of the Nipmuc way of life. Elias made his final, critical decision. The gold lode would remain secret, instead of opening a gold mine. Elias focused his immense capital and resources on the very thing Kett had claimed to want: iron, the underlying magnetic source that guided. The copper compass was a massive high-grade iron ore deposit. Elias established the copper compass foundry near the claim. The facade, the name itself, was a nod to his journey. But the function was strategic. He built an iron forge and smelter, making his immense wealth appear to derive from the valuable, but industrially necessary, iron and copper extracted from the surface veins, needed for the booming colonial shipbuilding and tool-making industries. The reality, the foundry became the most prolific source of high-quality iron and steel in the colonies. This was the legacy forged in iron. The secret, the gold-laced quartz, remained hidden beneath the copper veneer, its secret known only to Elias and Wamsutta. The gold was discreetly mined only in small, controlled amounts to be used exclusively as political capital. Elias, now a wealthy and respected industrialist, quickly became a pivotal figure on the road to rebellion. His foundry was strategically located and became an indispensable supplier of cannons, muskets, cannonballs, and the heavy tools necessary for the colonial armies. The hidden gold, deployed by Wamsutta and Elias through secret Philadelphia accounts, was used to fund colonial spies, creating a secure network to monitor British military movements, purchase foreign arms, using his gold to acquire weapons from French and Dutch suppliers, bypassing British restrictions. Support the Nipmuc. Elias fully honored his oath to Kitchener. The Nipmuc nation received a perpetual lease on their traditional lands, paid for by Elias in gold-backed coin, with guaranteed protection of the sacred areas, including the mineral spring. Wamsuta became the foreman of the Nipmuc crew working the copper veins, earning wages that allowed the tribe to buy necessary supplies on their own terms, maintaining their dignity and sovereignty. The copper compass foundry thus became an essential, clandestine arm of the burgeoning revolution. Elias, the former debtor, was now financing the revolution against the very system that had almost destroyed him. Decades passed. The American Revolution was won, powered in part by the iron and copper flowing from the Pine Barrens, backed by the secret wealth of the hidden gold. Elias Thorne lived to see the birth of the new republic. His personal debt had fueled his journey, but the price of his dominion had resulted in a legacy far greater than simple wealth. On the land, the region remained rugged and protected. The Copper Compass Foundry, a success, was not the destructive, avaricious venture Ket had planned. The Nipmuc lands remained largely intact, their culture sustained by a powerful, self-governed economy based on the foundry's wages. On the lineage, Elias, through his political influence and financial aid to the new government, secured a pardon for his cousin Julian. Julian, disillusioned but redeemed, eventually returned to the new America, working alongside Elias to build the new nation's infrastructure, the brotherly duel of ideals resolved by a shared commitment to the new republic. The secret kept Elias. Late in his life, passed on the true secret of the gold lode, the copper compass, and the French cartography to his only son, along with a sacred vow that the gold must forever remain a tool for freedom and protection, never for selfish dominion. The copper compass was to be a reminder of the old world's debt and the new world's sacred trust. The echoes in the Pine Barrens were not the sound of gold being hauled away, but the steady, rhythmic clang of the forge hammers, a sound of productivity, alliance, and liberty. Elias Thorne, the London clerk who had nearly succumbed to the shadow of inherited debt, had used the earth's richest resource not to accumulate personal power, but to forge the iron sinews of a new nation. His was a legacy forged in iron, paid for by the secrecy of gold, and anchored by the ultimate wisdom he had learned in the unforgiving wilderness, that true freedom is only achieved when the pursuit of fortune is bound by the unbreakable oath of the sachem. The price of dominion had been high, but the resulting liberty was priceless.